Please be warned that this podcast has strong language and adult content. That's it. That's all you're getting, Richard.
That's it.
That's it, mate.
Welcome everybody to the podcast. There's Jim. I'm Richard. With us is Blind Fury. That's all you're getting, Jim.
That was the worst intro I've ever heard. There's no energy. Didn't care.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the podcast of podcasts, where gamers can game and learn new and interesting things. Or not.
Matthew is already better than you, Richard. You're fired.
Yeah, I've known this for a while. And I just met him earlier a while ago. I mean, so I already knew he was better. He's hired. See you later. Bye, Felicia. I'm gone.
Welcome to the podcast, guys. Jim, that's miserable southerner is Richard, and joining us this week is community member Matthew, aka Blind Fury from the Discord. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Well,
Yeah, it's great to have
Jim's
you here.
idea, you know, Yankees. But anyway, it is good to have you in here, and glad to meet you. I know, I've seen you posting out there, and I know you're already way more intelligent than me. So, I'm just going to sit back and listen. And I doubt I learned anything, but I'm going to try. I'll promise you that.
I do declare. I guess I'll try and teach you or learn you. Yeah, learn you. That's what it is.
Yeah, we do the learning down here in the South. You know?
And something interesting we have with Matthew, Rich, is that he's just created a D&D 5e character for his first D&D 5e game, although he's very experienced in many other RPGs.
It's true.
Excellent.
Actually, I made one rogue and then ended up switching over to a warlock, which I'm having a great deal of fun making. I love min-maxing and digging into character development. It's probably my favorite part of role-playing is just building characters.
So you were saying that you play tested Pathfinder 2e, and I started out on D&D 3.5, although I've never played Pathfinder. What do you find the biggest differences directly between Pathfinder and D&D 5e, like on the surface, just jumping in for a character?
So, I have not played the published version of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. What I've been told, it's very similar to the playtest. If I should break down the difference between what Pathfinder was for someone who's not familiar with it, like in terms of what it was to 3.5, and what it was to what the playtest did for us. Anyone who's done 3 or 3.5, there were a lot of options out there, but players often wanted to consolidate or get more granularity in their character building and development and advance in interesting directions. And that typically came from feats or character traits in different class development. And Pathfinder, because Wizards of the Coast published D&D 3 and 3.5 as an open game license, so that essentially as long as you credited them, you could build in their sandbox. A lot of companies built stuff. Like I even have, my wife got me a Judge Dredd future role-playing game based on their 20th D20 Modern setting. So there's lots of material out there. Yeah, that's totally worth picking up too. I believe that's on Drive-Thru RPG as well. It is a real interesting setting for anyone who likes the Judge Dredd universe. But I digress. But the thing that Pathfinder did was they basically built the game that I think a lot of players wanted, which was the option to have more choices. And it kind of got out of control. There was a lot. You could do a lot of things depending on how many supplements you chose to add and which ones you picked from. You could min-max to your heart's desire ad infinitum. And what 2nd edition Pathfinder did was they said, okay, essentially we've put so many choices into the game, it's very difficult for people to keep up with these things. We want to give people a somewhat more streamlined experience, but still keep to the heart of those choices. So, for example, I think I built a goblin character, a wizard or a sorcerer. No, it was a sorcerer. And you could pick the goblin race, and then there were traits you could pick up as a goblin. You could grab a feat or two, but a lot of your things that you did were modified by bonuses, and it was a stat bonus based on your level at the time. So, for example, like a level, without going into too much detail, you'd end up with like a level 2 character would have a +2, a level 4 character would have a +4, something like that. The problem that came with that was that a lot of your combat results and your contested results were modified by that, and the difference in the modified results would determine your effectiveness. And what ended up happening was if you fought a much higher level character, at least in the playtest, more than 4 or 5 levels, it was almost impossible to do anything against them. And likewise, if you were a lower level character, or if you were the higher level character, it was harder for enemies or other people to hurt you or do things. So everything was streamlined into those modifiers to a point where it was very difficult to gain an advantage strategically because of the way the numerical interactions worked.
Well, it was predetermined to an extent, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, there were some ways to work around it, and I'm sure people listening to this will have the the actually moment. Actually, you could do this. And
there's always those.
That's right. This one doesn't know what
know-it-alls.
I don't know. This one doesn't know what he's talking about. I figured out how to get around that in the first game I played.
You're so smart.
Pushing the glasses up on the nose, that sort of thing. But I mean, that was my experience, and in just reading through 5th edition, what they've done is they've taken the best parts of, I think, what Pathfinder did in its 2nd edition, and what D&D and a lot of other games were known for, which was giving you lots of choices, but they've streamlined it into a better. You still have tons of choices, but a lot of them are pre-scripted depending on where you are in your development. Like, for example, the basic 3 choices in 5th edition that I see are race, class, background. And from those, it guides you in a direction when you're building a character. Like, do you want to be a wizard? Do you want to be a gnome? If you want to be gnome, do you want to be a rock gnome or a forest gnome? And you can min-max those by picking the benefits you want, but it lets you chunk a lot of those choices into role-playing based choices. And then if you want to min-max based on the results of those role-playing choices or vice versa, you can. But it makes it a lot simpler. Like, I can just say, I mean, even in the player's handbook, in the developmental section, I'm like, here's a quick character builder. Yeah, just pick these 3 things and your character's built. Done.
Yeah, it's pretty impossible to fuck it up and have a bad time playing a game.
Yeah, I mean, I might disagree with some of the choices that the thing recommends as optimal build choices, but they're there, and you even have a stat array that you can pick. Which I like as a GM. It means that I can just point to characters and say, every one of you pick the stat line. None of you are going to have a 3 for intelligence, and none of you are going to have six attributes at 18. And everyone's going to be roughly equal. And it's a good place to start. And because the modifiers in 5e are quantitative, but they don't outclass or move you in and out of different success ranges, I like the way you can build. You can build for consistency, or you can build towards focusing around one attribute or one skill. It feels like you're building a character, as opposed to when I started in 2nd edition. The hit system was THACO, which is to hit armor class 0.
Yeah.
And there was an entirely counterintuitive set of math. I mean, at the time, we didn't have anything to compare it to, so it seemed like the only system. It was obviously the best. But having gone into things like Dungeon World and a lot of other gaming systems since then, I really I can see where the system sort of fell down on under the weight of its own assumptions. Like you had non-weapon proficiencies; those were your skills. And the very fact that they define them as there's weapon proficiencies, and there are these few sub-skills which aren't related to killing things, said a lot about the way the game was set up. And there were other things too, like each class advanced with different experience requirements. If you're a rogue or a bard, you advanced much faster than, say, a paladin or a priest. or cleric. There were a lot of things that you assumed to be in evidence which were not necessarily so. And classes were not, I mean, it wasn't like 4th edition where you basically, each class had the same set of skills. They were just titled different things in a lot of ways. And you got the same result. You just got it by using a spell versus a sword or something like that. But you had different classes that were useful at different levels in different ways, depending on how intelligent your GM was. At higher levels, especially like if you got really high into like the 20s, you needed combat, you need melee fighters, because most really bad monsters had huge magic resistances or themselves were magic users.
Yeah, it seems like D&D 5e is a step between 3.5 or Pathfinder and something like Dungeon World, where it's a more narrative game, right? Like as you were saying, with D&D 5e, you're really creating a character, and you're not always thinking about min-maxing just because of the way they've set it up narratively. And with those modifiers, it doesn't make that much of a difference, especially when you're starting out. And you're more likely to read the descriptions of how things work as opposed to what, numerical buffer they give you.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the elements that drove me into Dungeon World initially was the battle map. For anyone who's played 3.5 or 3, battles were I'm a miniature gamer. I love war games. I play them all the time. I probably play war games more than I do role playing games as on an averaged basis through since 2000, and it really took away from the experience. I mean, if that's what you wanted to do, it was great. But for someone who's visually impaired, there are a lot of abstract choices you have to make in a hex-based game, which is essentially, or square-based, tile-based, however you want to call it, that strategically you had to coordinate with all your friends if you wanted an optimal outcome. If you were like me and you were a more strategic player, you weren't willing to settle for a lesser outcome or a bad choice. You would agonize. Everything you did was, will I cross someone's threatened square? Will I provoke
10-minute decision?
Yeah. And someone else would say you could do this, or if you do this, I'll do this. And if you had 3 or 4 of us with strategic, what you ended up doing was basically playing the old, what I call the old game of Pandemic, the first board game, where essentially the game devolved into one person has to tell everybody else what they have to do turn by turn, and everyone group would vote on the strategy, or there was mass chaos, which is its own entertainment, but it didn't lead to fun gaming sessions for me. Yeah. Everything had to be mapped out. There was a lot of prep work. I felt bad for our GM, honestly. Sure, you can model the things with Skittles and pretzels if you have to, and it wasn't like we lacked for miniatures, but it had to have been difficult to hand sketch every single battle zone or room every time we got into it and pre-think and move through the math. It's literally like the GM was playing against the characters, as opposed to a narrative style. And now that the battle map is an option, but it's not a requirement, things like, most of the combat feats in 3 and 3.5 were based around some element of the battle map, whether it was threatened squares, whether it was provoking attacks of opportunity, whether it was pushing people into other squares. Ranges were in squares. Not having that anymore allows GMs to interact in a more narrative fashion. And it's easier for people like me who have a visual impairment to describe the battlefield and talk through preconceptions, and people can make choices. And I don't have to say, well, you're actually 5 steps away from this person. I mean, you guys have experienced that. Was it someone on Knights of the Braille was trying to do a kill team version of the Warhammer 40,000 game that could be played virtually, and it's exactly the same scenario. How do you get people who can't actually count the blocks when you're talking about diagonals and potentially cross diagonals at weird angles? How do you determine range?
Yeah, the only way we figured to do that was play by post, because if you sat down to play it, it would take hours.
Yeah, and that's not fun.
No.
I mean, I don't. So I've played a lot of the Games Workshop based miniatures systems. I've played Privateer Press, and I will tell you that any game that takes more than like 60 minutes to play, you start valuing the experience based on the outcome, whether you lose or win. At least I do. And it's different if I take a game that can be played quickly and I decide to stretch it into a 4-hour game because I want to have a glass of bourbon with a friend and we want to laugh at how badly we rolled. But if minimum playtime ends up being like 2-3 hours, and that's with me not drinking a glass of bourbon and working my models around, and every choice is a gut-wrenching, switch between what the dice will roll and whether I made a good choice or not, then whether I win or lose does actually start to impact how much I enjoy it. And I think removing the battle map was one of the best moves I've seen from, I guess, 3. I didn't really play 4th. I've already played miniature game.
I've never played it.
And I mean, it looked like a great miniature game with some excellent tangential role-playing opportunity based on the mechanics to me. And I'm sure, again, there's someone who'll push and say actually, etc. And I respect other people's choices there. It just wasn't the game for me at that time. So I think the edition looks great.
I'd love to have the option to play with a battle map, but as you say, the amount of prep as well for the GM, because the other advantage of narrative combat is that you can bullshit your way through it as well. You'd be like, oh, actually, yeah, there's a tree over there. Sure, yeah, you can do that.
Yeah. So, and like when a player, it gives you the option of like when a player says, are there any small stones in the area? Is there a pool of water somewhere in the room? If you have a character who's lost a spell component pouch and the component is a cup of water, it might be fun. Like if you draw everything out, you can still say there's a pool of water here, but it wasn't drawn there before. Now you got to draw it in. There's labor associated with the game. It's one of the reasons I like Dungeon World is it's not the lack of precision in terms of the battlefield allows people to ask questions and you to answer, and it's just a call and response style of storytelling.
I find it fascinating though that you're into min-maxing and getting the most out of strategic decisions, but then you're quite happy to jump into a game where it's very imprecise. So I don't expect people with your sort of mindset of games to adapt to other games like that. I always think, min-maxers must think that our way of running the game is so shit.
I mean, it also depends, I guess. So I had an experience, I guess it was, I can't remember. It would have been like mid-2000, somewhere between 2005 and 2010. A friend of ours ran a Fate-based game called Spirit of the Century. It's made by Evil Hat Games, and it's a gaming system that's built around the pulp style of, if you've ever watched like the old A-Team was a very pulpy game, a pulpy TV show. And the idea was that sometime between World War I and World War II, you're playing a superhero. But it's more of the old Dick Tracy style of superhero, and you really like the Batman cartoons or comic books sort of, where you would leave the game, you would leave an episode on a cliffhanger where it looked like the guy was going to be run over by a vehicle and knocked off a cliff, and then later you would figure out how they survived it or what happened. It turned out the guy was a clone or a body double, or the person had a trap door in their car that he jumped out of, something like that. And you could make interesting characters. And one of the things like that I had a real problem with the beginning of this is like the whole concept of pulp and storytelling is that min-maxing, you are supposed to fail in good pulp storytelling. In fact, failure is the way that you advance the story. Like a character who never fails isn't interesting to read about. It's a Mary Sue who's overpowered, and they're always going to win. Like one of my friends used to joke that Superman was playing a game about talking to other people, and like his problem was he could never really be defeated. Half the time you had to. I think when he was playing like a Marvel game, he would roll to see if Superman would remember which power he had, because he had so many of them.
Yeah.
And that's like, it's fun because you're curious about it, but it's also fun to read about how he has problems interacting with people in the real world where he can't use his superpowers. So as a character, I tried to min-max my way. I tried to win everything. And it wasn't a fun game. And then someone pointed out, look, just allow yourself to fail. You're not going to die. Your character's going to be there afterwards. Allow yourself to fail and embrace the story that creates. And I modified my character for the next game we played, and they were totally right. It was the best thing. I failed. I fell. Terrible things happened, and like you had the big reveal every once in a while when someone would turn around. The whole story, the system is based on a die. You roll 4 dice. They're called fudge dice, and they have either a blank space on the side, a plus, or a minus.
I've played some fudge games before.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Like,
yeah,
you can have the staggeringly +4, but usually it's a +1 or -1, and occasionally it's the that did not go the way I expected it to.
Yeah. In fact, Jacob Wood, who does the Accessible Gaming Quarterly magazine, created a game called Saving Abel that ran off the fudge dice system.
Yeah,
and it was fantastic.
And like another thing that system did for me is one of the things you can do is you can spend kind of like poker chips to add bonuses to things, but they have to be based off of taglines. And the taglines are often like the James Bond shaken not stirred, post-kill pun sort of stuff. And like I had essentially a street magician who could change his appearance, do sleight of hand, had a sword. It was basically a sword fighting version of Harry Houdini. And I love the character. And like one of the things was he didn't actually have magic. And he had just had sleight of hand and stuff like that. And one of his taglines was, "I hate hocus pocus." And the GM could pay you extra tokens back. So as you spent them, he could pay you to take negative results, like to do things that he wanted you to do to tell a better story. And you would end up with scenarios where I would pretend to have actual magic or interact with magical things, and I would be about to do something amazing, and the GM would pass me a stack of things that would say, but you hate hocus pocus. And I'm like, son of a gun, you're right. I do. And like, do I? And you would get to a bidding scenario where you're like, so you're not willing to take the negative result for 2 chips. How about 3, 4? I'm like, okay. And my character would be tied up and dropped somewhere, and someone else would have to help me, or I'd have to narrate how I got out of it. And it meant for better stories. So, and what's the nice thing is that like I love diving into the kind of the min-maxing, crunchy side of riffs, or I love fight to win, outthink the puzzle, outthink your enemies, find a strategic way around your opponents. But there is something to be said about telling a great story in which you succeed and you don't have to worry about the die rolls. Like what Dungeon World does is it takes worrying about the small stuff out. And as a GM and as a player, it means you can just focus on doing the things that you want to tell a great story. So you still get the same result, but you don't have to worry about the small stuff. And I think there's value in both styles of play. And as a GM, it frees me. I don't prepare anything for my games because players never do what I expect them to or want them to. So I end up running a lot of stuff where, so as a GM, for example, there's a move in Apocalypse World and Dungeon World have a lot of spin-offs and people that build off their systems. And one of them basic moves is called, there's hack and slash, there's volley for combat, but there's discern realities. And discern realities is pretty much the reason I love Dungeon World straight as a core system, because you roll dice. Say it's 2d6. Everything is 2d6 in Dungeon World, unless you're rolling damage or a couple small things. And then if you add your relevant attribute modifier, and if your result is 10 or more, you get to ask 3 questions. And if your result is 7 or more, you get to ask 1 question. And the questions are things like, of what here is of use to me? What happened here? What's going to happen here? What here is not as it appears to be? Who's in control? Like I said, what here is valuable to me? So it's all the search things, but it's none of the I tap on the wall with a hammer, or I very carefully look for marks in the dust to see if they're footprints. And it does mean that players are maybe a little less creative when it comes to interacting with the environment, but it also means that we skip 2 hours of I tap on the wall with a hammer.
Yeah.
And and I tell you what the result is, and there's no arguing about it. You can't redo it afterwards. I'm like, yeah, you rolled a 6, so mark experience, you don't find anything, and we move on. It's a final answer, and a Dungeon World, and I think a lot of the systems like that you lose a little bit, but you gain a lot if you want to tell a good story. You can ask online players.
You touch on a lot of stuff there, and for example, saying about the storytelling with failure, the storytelling comes from the collaborative experience with your party, and when your character succeeds all the time, the rest of the party are like, well, he doesn't need our help, so let's just stand back. Whereas if you're failing, the party can step in and help, and it feels like more of a group experience. But the issue that I find with D&D 5e is what makes it strong is also what makes it weak for me. That is, once you create a character, you're almost a superhero from the beginning. Now you pretty much have access to everything. Failure is an option at the beginning, but by the time you get to level 10, it's pretty rare that you'll fail a skill check of most kinds. And I find it a little frustrating that way. I do like the storytelling aspect, like you're saying about people going around knocking on stuff and looking. Some people in D&D 5e absolutely love that, but I enjoy some of that crunch, some of the additional mechanics that you're talking about with a lot of dice rolling and modifiers and stuff, which can contribute to storytelling for people that are maybe less imaginative as well. But yeah, I get what you mean with Dungeon World. That's a good way to push forward, ignore all the little stuff, like for example in D&D 5e, some dungeon masters follow encumbrance and some don't, and again it's your style. But that's the good thing. The one really good thing with D&D 5e is you can just dump stuff that you don't want to use, and it doesn't really affect the game.
Yeah, I think that's so. I mean, comparatively, here's what I would say in like the scenario you've presented. The difference is, like in 5e and a lot of those styles of games, it's up to the GM to create a challenge or present it. And I'll give you like 2 examples. The reason, because it's up to the GM in a lot of ways to make sure that the group has, like everyone in the group has something to do. I've read a couple of GMing books, and I always like to hear what other GMs find as problematic, because sometimes it's not something that I particularly care about. And one of the things that I think it was Robin's Rules of Gaming or something like that. I can't remember, or maybe it was the Lazy GM's the Guide or something like that. But it said essentially there are players who they're just there so that they can eat chips, drink Mountain Dew, and spend time with their friends, and they don't really care about the game. It's just a thing to do together. And if you can identify what people want, you can actually, individual players, you can try and build those components into your campaigns and stories. And I think that's a really good insight into an element that I had a problem. I ran first edition Exalted for many years. It's probably my favorite of the high fantasy systems by White Wolf and other game systems. And the game has moved on to, I think, in its 3rd edition right now. But one of the things I really cut my teeth on was, if you're running for demigods, basically superheroes, in the system. Literally, you can roll 20 d10s for results. It was one of the appeals of the system, I think, to a lot of players. But there was a point at which you just couldn't, on an individual monster, you would not be able to challenge them. And what I found as a GM for scenarios like that was helpful was, one, it doesn't matter whether they're mechanically challenged. It matters whether the player feels challenged. And I would describe a monster that they would obviously massacre in 2 rounds of combat. But if a mouth is coming down a hall and it's open and you can see the grinding teeth of the worm coming towards you and you don't know what its level is or its hit points, you feel threatened. And that's all that really matters in that case, is that if the player feels like their character was threatened or not. Even if they kill it in 2 hits, 30 minutes of terror and that adrenaline hit is all that matters.
And the one thing I've found with saying about tailoring certain parts of the campaign to players, I've found recently that the best thing to do is just to ask the player, like, hey, what do you want to do with your character? What would you like to happen? What do you think is cool? Just tell me and I'll figure it out.
I mean, and understanding what people want to get out of the game is super helpful. Not like, do you care if your character advances? Do you have a plan? Because when I make a character at first level, I'm thinking every choice I make is either based around how I think my character concept would play out in a mechanical sense, or if it's like a spell choice, like what is the optimal play going to be so that I have a versatile character, a useful character at level 20. Somewhere in between those 2 extremes, usually both.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, man.
I was going to say, so basically what you're saying there is you like to start off with like a good base, a good building block. Because most first level characters are like really, really squishy, especially anybody in campaigns that I run. But you want to make it make sense if they get up to 10th, 15th, and 20th level.
Yeah,
that's what I'm getting from what you're saying. I just want to make sure that my idiot self is understanding.
That's right. I mean, the example I would give is, it's why I've spent like 2 days just reading through every spell I can find and double checking how the Warlock class works. Warlocks don't really get to cast that many spells other than their cantrips.
No,
the ones they do cast, especially at higher levels, are maxed out power. But you need actual spells that scale well, which means you want something that's either has utility, preferably both, something like Shatter that adds damage and has an external mechanical effect. Or is it Armor of Advocacy? Is an hour-long spell that both adds temporary hit points, adds more hit points as you get more spell levels, and lets you do damage to people who attack you. It's good against hordes. It's the old use of the spell Grease, I think, is the example that I would, or Web, are 2 spells that any like long-term gamer in D&D world is familiar with. Like, you can get a lot of value out of those 2 spells depending on what you want to do with them.
Right.
They're both fire starter. They're both present potential fuel. I can't tell you how many forests have been burned down in my games due to players using excessive amounts of web over and over again. I hate that spell. But Levitate's another one. Like, they're only as useful as you want them to be. But you, as a warlock, I want spells that scale up, and I also want like my cantrips. Oh, that is another thing with 5th edition I absolutely adore. They made cantrips useful.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're actual spells now that you can cast all the time.
Yeah.
And they're super useful, and you should pick based on what's going to be useful for you as a player and a character, but also like what's fun to do. Like, I'm building a gnome tinkerer. Like, his background is someone who's going to fix things. So I want things like mend, but I can't get that as a warlock. So I'll have to pick a different pact so that I can get access to different things later on. And it's fun to build things that both build mechanical advantage into your character, but also tell a story.
It's funny that you say that, because you can tell a lot of the time from the cantrips that someone picks in D&D 5e what kind of player they are, if they're narrative or
Oh
or
yeah,
mechanical, or mixture of both.
I mean, thaumaturgy as a cantrip is just based around screwing with other people.
Oh yeah.
It's just straight up in there. It's like every description is like, how can I mess with everyone around me?
You can heat up arrow tips and fire them.
I love me personally. I'm a mage hand fan because you can use it to mess with people too.
They need to add a full-fledged damage mage hand so you can just slap people all the time.
Because I've actually used it in my local session with the character who's no longer with us. I picked up a pile of crap with it and just held it in front of his face right as he walked into it. Just for strictly narrative purposes or narrative purposes. Because I thought it was funny. So I mean, it's got its uses, beyond strictly mechanical.
Sure. I mean, you can use it for narrative stuff. You can. I mean, it's the other cantrip I picked for my warlock is Mage Hand and Eldritch Bolt.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah, and it's another one like Unseen Servant or Speak with Animals. If you're willing to remove a couple of potential points of damage from your character's output, you'll gain a ton of versatility and may be able to work around problems, which I consider the hallmark of creative players. They're both the players that I love to run for, and I absolutely hate sometimes because if you build up a scenario in your head and it's going to play out this way, it often does not.
Personal experience on both sides of the screen there.
Yeah, I mean it's one of the reasons that I like Dungeon World a lot in that so I think there are a lot of I talked about Rifts before we started the recording, and Rifts is one of those systems like in the 90s where you'd start with this character who was supposedly a competent professional in whatever class they picked. In practice, if you weren't a combat class, the percentage chances of fixing or accomplishing things changed. And it was very difficult sometimes to get the character mechanically to react the way the book described them as being. Like they weren't ever quite, it's like, why is my professional mechanic acting like an intern with a monkey wrench and a large piece of metal? Like this is not how I'm supposed to fix computers. And Dungeon World fixes that by saying every roll that's not based on damage is going to be 2d6. A 7 or better is a 7 to 9 is a qualified success, and that means that you'll get success, but you'll have to take a small negative consequence or something else will happen. 10 or better is unqualified success, and if your result is 6 or less, you mark experience, so you get rewarded for it, but also the GM gets to do something else. And maybe it's advancing the plot of one of the enemies. Maybe it's something bad that happens to you. You don't know. I've had people fail rolls and they're like, why didn't anything bad happen? Why did you just turn experience? I'm like, you'll find out later. That's fine.
That's very ominous.
At
least they get rewarded for trying to participate in the game rather than feeling, I'm not going to engage because I'm worried of the negative outcome. At least they get the experience.
Yeah, but I mean, the person who introduced Dungeon World to me was me, my wife, and his wife at that time, and they. My wife and I would regularly fail rolls. It just happened. And it's because the more things you try to do, Dungeon World doesn't make you roll unless you're trying to actually affect an outcome that has chance associated with it. If you're just talking to NPCs, you don't roll things. If you're trying to haggle or affect a variable outcome, then you do. If it's a scenario where you're trying to force an outcome, essentially. And what we found is our characters were advancing very quickly, my wife and I, because we failed so much, we get lots of experience. And the other character was playing a druid and was just blowing her way through the scenario, just like winning. And it was great, but she was behind on the advancement, like the level turn. And it's because she was a fully competent character to begin with. And she did things that she was good at. And it made for a very different kind of experience. Like literally, if you just play to your strengths in Dungeon World, most of the time you're going to advance much slower.
Ah.
Yeah, I understand this now.
So it's a scaled system in which it's not a scenario where you start out weak. You start out as a full-fledged, competent character. And whatever happens after that is up to you. There's no difference between, in a lot of ways, a fighter and a mage. I mean, other than hit points, in that both of them can roll, and both of them can have high strengths if they decide to pick it that way. And another thing that changes is, at least in the way you're supposed to run Dungeon World, is you're supposed to go from each person to each person and say, okay, hold that thought for a second. What do you do? What does this other person do? So you just go around the table essentially, and there's no initiative. There's no you can split the party if you want. I'm gonna spend 5 minutes on each of you. We're gonna narrate your your combat results or what you choose to do. It makes for a more free-form gaming style where everyone gets a turn.
That's good etiquette as well for any game. Anyone running a game is when someone's doing something, go around and say, okay, yeah, you do that. Let's describe that. Now let's go around. What's everyone else doing at the same time, rather than just letting one person run the story, And with the combat, I've thrown away initiative in the last few games I've run, and I've just done turn-based, like player dungeon master, and I find that giving the players the opportunity to decide who goes next and what they're going to do gets them to discuss tactics more than when you roll initiative. It's just like, I get my go, I get to go before you, and so I'm going to do whatever I want.
Yeah, that's what I try to do, whenever they come to a battle or even in just a regular session, try to give everybody equal opportunity. And something that I've noticed is, say this week somebody will have a little bit more time than others, and next week they won't have as much time, and somebody else may get, a little bit more time. But it usually balances out fairly even. At least I think so.
Yeah, I guess that depends on what you want to get out of your game too. And that's one of the benefits. It's why I try to say, this is my preference. This is how I like to play. This is what I found. But it also depends on how you are as a player and a GM. There are some things that work for friends of mine that just don't work for me.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, talking about difficulty in your games and creating it with the game system available, we joke a lot that Richard kills his party, but I mean, Richard, you haven't found any trouble in presenting difficulty in D&D 5e, have you?
I don't. And like I told the players, I'll usually roll dice whenever I'm taking notes, just in case something happens or they come to a point, because I don't want it to be my decision. But at the same time, I don't have a problem with it being my decision. But I mean, heck, I like to roll dice too, and see the outcomes. And if it's a blizzard that lasts for a max of 8 hours, in the campaign, then it's a blizzard that lasts 8 hours in the campaign. If they die, they die. I did hold their hand in the first session because they were level 1, and I think the max hit points was 10. Maybe 11. Yeah. I'd have to look back at their character sheets at the time, and that's not fair to them. But at the same time, they could have kept going, but they did a smart thing by hunkering down in an area, and I felt that should be rewarded for their smart, thinking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. They were stuck in that blizzard, and you wanted to reward them, but what I mean is that your style of play is that you're like, here's the game mechanics, and I'm going to abide by those, and that's how I like to run the game. And if that's how you enjoy it, then we're going to have a fun time. And you set that at the beginning of your campaign for Rime of the Frost Maiden, right?
Yes, and if you don't like it, I can hit disconnect on you and kick your ass out of the channel. If you do like it, if you do like it, by all means, feel free to stay because your character's going to die anyway. But yeah, I see what you mean now, and I mean that's how it is. This is what's going to happen. If you like it, stay. If you're not, then we'll find somebody else. Not to be an asshole or anything, but that's how I like to run it.
I mean, that's one of the things about riffs, and I'm going to say, like, I talked before about how sometimes you value the experience based on the amount of time you put into something.
Yeah.
Whether it's a game or something. It's also for character creation. Like, the more time it takes me to make a character, and it determines how much I'm vested in that character. And if I take 6 hours to make a character, not because I'm choosing to, but because there are a lot of choices and I have to read through every equipment list to try and maximize my God, second edition D was a mess. like how do I get the most out of 150 gold when I have 3,000 pieces of equipment to choose from?
Right.
And like in that case, if I've spent 6 hours and I die in the first 2 games, I'm going to be upset.
Right.
Or like maybe, and, it's different if you expect it. But then there are games like Dungeon Crawl Classics where you make 8 characters as starting, and you start as a horde, and they're all 0 level, and the ones you keep are the ones who lived through the first scenario. So,
oh my god!
I mean, there's lots of random stuff out there, depending on how people want to approach it. And at least for me, what I tell people is, I just want to know what kind of game I'm getting into, and if the answer is that the GM literally doesn't care, and it's up to me to survive, and if I choose to fight the dragon, I'm going to lose.
Yeah,
it's on me. That's good to know. I mean, it means I'm going to be a lot less picky. It's why I like going to cons and doing like one shots, because I don't have to worry about that character tomorrow. I just have to figure out what I'm going to do for the next 4 hours, and it means you'll take more risks.
I found that with the mini campaigns I run. I've just run one for Wrath and Glory, and I'm doing one for Alien RPG again in a month or so. And when I say to people, like, this is going to be 4 to 8 sessions, and here's your character, and you could die, they're a little more reckless, but knowing that they can die, they think about their decisions. Like a lot of D&D 5e podcasts, I'll listen to a lot of different ones to try and get ideas or to hear how they play it, and it rarely feels like anyone is in danger in a lot of them. And I think to myself, well, there's not really any weight to the decisions you're making because there's no consequence, really. I mean, the ultimate consequence in D&D or most tabletop role-playing games is that you die.
Yeah. I mean, that's something else at least I've taken from Dungeon World is in my last campaign, I ran a story arc for my players, and the one barbarian just kept throwing himself, taunting. It was his stand-up move. Taunted everything. Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
He's in my group. Yep.
Halfling barbarian, taunt everything, attack everything, and if it involves talking, defer to the mage. And it was great. He was a fantastic little halfling with a mild Mexican accent. It was fantastic. It was a great character. And he died twice. Once because he actually died, and the second time because when he made a bargain with Death and he broke it, Death came back and yanked him back and made another bargain with him that was worse. And it's one of those weird scenarios where sometimes characters die. It's nice to know you're at risk, or at least feel that way. And I know from like one of the things that the Apocalypse World and Dungeon World system does is you start off with a certain amount of hit points plus your constitution, and that's it. You don't get more hit points as you level up. So, the whole thing is scaled down. Damage is less because you don't have the massive modifiers. But, the most you're going to run into with that is around 28 or 30 hit points for a character. And for a normal D&D game, that's... unless you have a lot of armor or magical defenses, that's really not that much.
No. And you can always find a game system that tailors to the style that you want to play. Like D&D 5e is definitely, once you're past level 3 or 4, you start to breach that I'm pretty safe to an extent. It's only after several bad decisions that I'm going to be in a bad way. Where if you want a game that holds those consequences, and you can pick a different game system. I think it frustrates me when people complain about D&D 5e for the mechanical arrangement of it, and it's like, well, there are other games you can go and play.
Sure. I think it was Everwind, Evervale, it was a game that was put up by, I believe it was Wizards of the Coast, that's completely diceless. There are no mechanics. You pick powers. like there's as many, or you can do something like Rolemaster, which is chart based, and or some of the more complex games, Inquisitor, or some of the Games Workshop products that were put out by a couple of people they're also heavily chart based. Hero, formerly known as Champions, is just it's a good game, but man, the system is very mechanically intensive. And if you want that, you can get that very easily. You can also go for scaled down systems. As I get older, I just want to tell a good story. I want people to have a good time, and I don't want to. Maybe this is a function of being in my 40s, but I personally don't. I can't manage a 12-hour gaming session anymore.
No.
It's just not in me. For one thing, I mean, there are variables that come into play. I'm going to fall asleep, or I'm going to consume enough alcohol, or I'm going to consume enough alcohol that no one's going to want to play in the game, or my cat's going to have a problem, or one of my players is going to get upset. It's just not worth it. So finding simpler systems where we're not arguing over rules for 4 hours makes it so that I want to. I mean, my games. We used to just. When I was in college, we would sign up for a local, I guess you'd call it like a cabin. And we would start, I as the GM would start at whatever time we got there. And we would go till sunup or more. A friend's lake house, we do the same thing. We just game until we couldn't anymore, go to sleep or pass out as the case may be, wake up, buy the local grocery store out of pierogi, bacon, and eggs. And, there would be, at the end of each session, at the end of each weekend, you would see like the empty bottles of liquor, the bones of the T-bone steaks that had been consumed, and the cat and the giant pyramid of beer cans. And it would literally, we would game until we couldn't anymore, wake up and do it all over again. I can't do that anymore. So I want systems that allow me to extract the most value out of the very limited time that I'm willing to do it.
So that's what I was going to say, is that those long weekends, there's a lot of fluff in there. There's a lot of breaking stuff down, as you say, arguing over rules. And when you've only got 3 hours, you're like, okay, this and this doesn't matter. And, we want to play a game that embraces this part of it. And do you find that it's a cleaner experience playing a shorter session like that?
It is if you make it that way. I've done some games where that's not necessarily the case. One of the systems that I got into for several years is called Dragon Storm, which is a kind of a cross between Magic the Gathering and a role-playing game. Originally it was a game that was published right around the time in the late 90s that used collectible. Literally, you would buy packs of cards, and your character was a set of cards that you added, but you had to buy, sight unseen packs of cards to make it work. And then now you can buy the cards are available for download or purchase. But it was also a living rule system in which a character could play in one GM or Warden's game, and then go to a different GM and take the same character, and it would advance in different games. It's a very interesting system in which you're playing. It's literally a living world in which your character is a living character, and your character would play with other characters who did things in certain adventures. It led to a very episodic style of play.
Yeah.
Which I found interesting. I did it over Skype before I was, before Discord, like in the early 2000s. It was fun, but you ended up having to very much not dumb down. You needed to. I found that like the longer sort of rambling storylines that I was used to running for older game settings didn't work very well, because you only had 4 hours, and if you didn't finish the story, it was going to be hard to get all your players back again to continue it, to get to a narrative point where you could finish it and you felt okay with the result. Even if you're running a long-term campaign, like, people could play in it, but you still wanted people generally to have some form of closure at the end of each session.
Yeah.
So now, if you're going to do 3 hours, you want to make sure you get some. I want to get some real value out of it, and I think it does force me as a GM to condense down what I want players to do, or pick a stopping point, where I'm like, okay, this is a good point to stop. And like, I never used to think about that. Like, we stopped when I could not stand on my feet anymore, or keep my eyes open. Like, that was it. And like, that's different than my approach now, and I think it's different for players too. It's something to do.
I definitely find myself thinking about where's a good place to leave here. There's maybe a cliffhanger or maybe a nice clean cut to move on to next week, rather than just I think I've had enough. I feel like I can put more energy into it and then sort of walk away feeling good about it, rather than, should I have cut it off here? Should I have changed this? Should I have done that? And I can stay focused for longer.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it's also one of the scenarios I'm like, as I've told my friends, like, if I die, all right, well, I'm going to walk away, especially now with COVID, where everyone's locked down and we're sitting here in like different parts of the country and playing. Like, all right, well, I just put myself on mute. I'm going to go get a snack, or, talk to my wife, or listen to you guys and laugh in the background, or heckle in the chat. And like, there's no downside to this.
I've got wireless headphones, so I'll wander off. So what game would you consider to be your favorite of all time? I know it's a pretty loaded question, and it changes with how you're feeling at the time, but you clearly have a lot of experience with a variety of games. Do you have any top picks, or something that you'd love to go back to that you haven't got the chance?
I mean, okay, so those are like 3 or 4 questions.
Well, Jim can't count, so
that's true. Yeah, I have to take my socks off to count over 10.
I mean, it's because he has to convert to the metric system.
This is true.
Bloody colonials.
Imperial weights and measures for life. So if there was a game that I've never had a chance to play or run in that I really wanted to, is it's one called Hellas. I went to Gen Con back when we could meet in person and do stuff, and my first trip, for someone who's never been there, like, it's, you submit an event and then people sign up for your events. They buy tickets, and it's often a lottery system, but you walk in and there are hundreds. It starts Thursday night and it goes till Sunday night. And literally there are people running games, board games, video games, role-playing games that you've never heard of. They have live action games where you walk in. I went in they had a simulator with airsoft where you were walking into a space station, and they had sound effects and actors playing characters.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff there. There's cosplay. There's a merchant's hall like you've never seen before. And the thing I wanted to do, because I GM'd for a long time at that point, the game, I wanted to see other games. I wanted to see what other games were out there, and I wanted to see what was interesting. And one of the games, because like the really popular stuff sold out very quickly. And I ended up, to my advantage, having to pick from obscure things that no one had heard of before. And one of them was a game called Hellas. And it's a game that's designed to be played through multiple generations of your family. Like, not you personally, but your character dies, and then the next generation you play that. And it's a Roman theme that's been converted to high science fiction. So the Hellenic, the Carthaginians essentially, or the Spartans, would be characters who walked around with flaming swords and power armor. Or instead of warp travel, you would sort of transition in space into a secondary universe in which if you wanted to travel faster, you had to go to the deeper parts of the sea, but there were bigger monsters like Scylla and Charybdis, and they had, so the faster you wanted to go between areas, the more danger you undertook. They had people who would blind themselves and had a crystal sphere that floated around them to allow them foretell the future. There was an entire bug race that dressed up as human heroes to be accepted into society and was an entire warrior class. There was a subset of like this one race of octopus people that were big into technology, and they would walk around in little powered suits of mechanoid creatures, and they had fairy creatures who were big into emotional manipulation and pheromones and stuff. And all of it existed in this very nice cohesive whole. Someone who read the original mythology back when I took Latin in the 90s. It's one of those scenarios where it's a game that had luscious detail, gorgeous play, and I got to play it with the designer who ran it, and I got to build a character.
Oh, cool.
And if you've ever read the Iliad or the Aeneid, or just gone through any of those stories and said, I don't want to do the Kevin Sorbo, Hercules, Xena version of mythology. I want to play the tragic. I want to give it the love and respect that it deserves. It's a weird combination of all the scientific sci-fi tropes that you've never, that you would expect would make it funny, like kind of like Galaxy Quest style, but then serious and glorious and rich in a way that I wish I had found a group that wanted to play, because a lot of my groups just evolve into people making dick and fart jokes. It's we all know each other. We all have our side. Yeah, I mean, but it's not. I got part of my degree from college was drama based, and I really like seeing people organically, not like decide what the outcome of the story is going to be, but being placed with a decision in front of you, decide organically how are you going to do that. Romeo, wherefore art thou? And Romeo walks in, and it's not a all right, and now we're it's fade to black, or we're in the bedroom. It's how does that emotional interaction work out? And that's the kind of game that Hellas is to me. I wish I could go back and either play it with someone running it who would give it that kind of treatment, or someone who run it for a group of people who really wanted to make a really good shot at it. In terms of the game that I basically has my heart, that's going to be Exalted First Edition from White Wolf. It was their first real jump into, back when White Wolf was White Wolf, in like high fantasy. A friend of mine play tested it before it was published, before we even met, actually. And it's one of those games where I've told so many stories running it. It's the longest campaign. I think it was almost like 10 years I ran for
Oh my God.
Yeah. And there are parts of it where the mechanics were terrible. I made some mistakes as a GM. People got interesting things. NPCs developed. My wife loved it. She still refers back to her character in that, if you've ever had that one game where you want to tell everyone else about it and no one else gets it because they weren't there, because it's super important to you, and no one's like, I wasn't there. It's like, it's just like another fantasy game, right? Like, no, it wasn't another fantasy game. That's what Exalted was to me.
I've read through the Exalted rules after you recommended it for the range bands, and I read through it. It sounds like combat in it is simplified to what you were talking about, where there's a bit of strategy there, but not enough that it bogs down the mechanics.
Yeah, so you're looking at third edition, which I have, and again, it's one of those game systems where I appreciate what they tried to do, but I think the thing is, like, they have a different mechanical system for everything. Crafting spells, crafting magical items, social interactions. They all have their own little like mini game that you're playing. Governing cities. All of it is different, and I do not have enough brain power to manage that many systems.
No. You mean that they
Exalted.
don't function alongside one another? They're different games altogether within it.
That's the way it feels to me as a GM. I want to be able to run it. I just don't think I have the capacity to do it. And it's a shame because reading through the main rulebook, it's probably the most evocative setting that White Wolf has published. And I've run a lot in Vampire Dark Ages, Vampire Modern a little bit. I still have all the original Vampire Dark Ages books and other things, but like Exalted is the one. If you want to tell like high fantasy, big stories with anime style characters, Exalted is the game that I would jump to immediately. It's people wielding 10-foot long swords that are 3 feet wide, mecha power armor that's powered by energy crystals. Different types of Exalted with different abilities. It's just an incredible high level system. But in order to be able to tell those kinds of stories, you also have to be able as a GM to dig into the mechanics and make it work. And I've backed every one of their Kickstarters because I want them to keep publishing material. But there's a little part of me that really hopes that someone with some sanity says, okay, we're going to dumb some of these down for the rest of you immortals who maybe don't want to read and memorize 60,000 pages of rules.
Yeah, I think a good way around that sort of stuff is obviously having uniformity so that stuff coincides better, but making stuff at a basic level and then adding the other stuff as optional is what I enjoy in games like that, where it's like, here's a bunch of stuff, but if you just want to run it very simply, you can just do this.
Yeah, and as someone who's visually impaired, so one of the things I think I've talked about in the Discord chat is there's a big difference between what I read and what I can actually use when I'm running and playing. You can give me a quote accessible PDF unquote, but in the middle of play, I cannot be listening to Jaws, the players narrating and reading. I don't have downtime as a GM. And as a player, I need to keep track of other stuff too. So I can't listen to Jaws reading me a PDF of the rules on social interactions and look up a reference point while things are going on. And that's not because I can't do it. It's because it's too much input for me to keep track of. So I tend to, with virtual gaming or in person, I tend to put things together into short chunks. I love Excel or usually Google Sheets because that's where I put most of my characters.
Yeah.
And it's nice to be able to just arrow down to a cell that says Constitution, and I can move over. I'm like, okay, what's my value? What's my modifier? But if I don't want to do that, I can just arrow down quickly, and I basically have a quick sheet that lets me jump through the basic details very quickly and find information. I don't know how do you guys balance that out? How do you balance between I have an infinite amount of information which I may need at any given time, and I have a very short time frame, and I need to be able to get quickly, and I can't reach out to a player and say, hey, can you look up this reference for me? Do
you want to go first, Richard?
Mine's pretty simple. I tell them to shut the hell up. I'm looking up something.
I know what Richard does. He does the same thing that I do, where he over prepares, and I have a Word document. I'm following an adventure at the moment for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and I take the parts of the adventure, I put it into a Word document. I'm only one session ahead at any time, so that if they diverge, I know somewhat how to prepare. And then any major rules I'm not familiar with that I have to include, I write them at the bottom of the document and link them at that part. I put all the NPC information in there, link that within the story frame so I can just select stuff and jump to it. But I ask people, and I'll just say to them as well, well, what do you think? They say, oh, I say this to someone. I'm like, well, which skill do you think would be relevant to that scenario? Or, do you want to tell us what you need to do? But what do you think, Richard?
Well, I am really blessed in that aspect because I do have Adrian who is sighted. So he 9 times out of 10 will be looking up something if I like hesitate or say, let me look that up, and he'll look it up while I can keep going. But I'm like Jim there. I take like an obsessive amount of notes. I have I have different Word document or WordPad documents because they tend to load quicker for me, and I can
Same.
do like a Control F to find certain things. Like I'll label like an NPC, for instance. I'll do like 3 asterisks. And I know whenever I type in to find 3 asterisks, that's exactly where it's carrying me. My only trouble is, and I wish I could find a program that will do this, but I haven't been able to yet, is I have to open up like 5 or 6 different WordPad documents. I wish I could find a program like they used to be called Ed Sharp that would open 10, 15 different documents, but it was all in like one screen. You could, control tab through them and move to a different document. Otherwise, I'm constantly alt tabbing to try to find the document that's open. And that's what's a headache for me. But for like battles and all, I'll do, like say villain 1, I'll do their attacks, their weapons, their damage. I don't usually type down like their strength or anything because, it's fills it up too much. I do bare basics, and then whenever they come to battle, I can access that quickly, and go on through the battle. But that's how I handle it.
I can see that. I mean, I know like one of the things that I've done is system resource documents, SRDs, are super useful if you, as a GM or player. It's one of the reasons I use my Chromebook a lot because all my information is virtual. I don't have to worry about saving a document or something. Like it's all in the cloud anyway. So system resource documents are super useful because you can just go there. It's free. You can easily check into the information and grab what you need. But the side effect of that is gotta have a net connection, and I don't. I don't think it's one of the reasons I tend not to. I love playing with GMs who work with modules. As a GM, I just don't. I don't like being tied down to. It's the way I get around that is just by avoiding the whole. You're in Greyhawk here. You're in you're in Waterdeep, in Forgotten Realms. Like we're just here. And that's I mean, literally, most of my campaigns have been. I give you the storyline. I give you the hook. And Dungeon World for me has worked well for that because it forces. In the initial character development, you build bonds with everyone, so the group starts out that way.
Yeah, I really like that. When you showed us Dungeon World and I was looking into it, I was like, that's a really cool idea to give the party a reason to be together. Whereas in D&D, it's like, I'm an edgelord. I don't need any of you. It's like, shut the fuck up. Just play a game.
You meet in a tavern,
See, I hate that. Like, it's great. It's like if you want to play a campy style, but like the elf, the dwarf, and the human like all meet in a bar, and the mayor comes in and said the town's being attacked by goblins. Can you guys help? Hey, and like this is the scenario that every fantasy every GM is taught. Like this is how you're supposed to start the group, and like somehow they'll decide through shared suffering, resource expenditure, killing shit, getting shit, and looting shit that they will become a group. I'm like that just doesn't work for me. It's terrible.
I'd love for a player one time to say, like you meet in the bar, the mayor comes in, the dragon's attacking us, and have a dwarf, because I just picture it being a dwarf. Well, you're fucked then.
See ya.
Yeah.
Guess you're not going to need this keg after all, huh? I'll take it with me.
The game I'm running now, I just
relocate.
said to them, like, here's what your characters want to do. Here's where they meet. Everything else is up to you. Like how you got there is up to you. Why you're pursuing this particular, quest is entirely up to you. Whether it's money or this or that, and then after that, you guys can decide. But at least they're all on the same page and they have a common goal. Because I found before in the past that trying to throw people into a game and then I'm trying to link them together and sell them on something. And I'm like, I'm going to try and just say to you guys, like, here's what your plan is, and then do what you want.
Yeah,
I don't know if it'll work. I guess we'll see.
But you always have that one character that either won't follow directions or like, I don't like people, but people really should like me. I'm a very interesting person if you bother to check beneath the gruff exterior. Like, I actually stand over here in a corner and find a table by myself and hope that someone will find me interesting enough to talk to me. Like, what do you mean? Why can't I be part of the group? I'm like, because you've been hiding in a corner? And I don't see why anyone would like you.
Yeah. I actually, Richard came into my last D&D campaign late, and you did a great job of integrating with the party, because Richard knew that if I want these guys to like my character, then I have to find out what their goals are and then support them to do that. And by doing that, they were like, "Oh, this guy's cool."
Yeah, even though he was an evil bastard. I mean,
secretly, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what you have to do, and ultimately, you have the same goals if you're joining the party. So why not support them? I mean, otherwise you're doing it by yourself.
Yeah, I think Dungeon World and the other game that strangely helped with that was Rogue Trader, the Games Workshop game. I think we scanned it and someone else edited it for us, but it's on Bookshare. It was the old Rogue Trader. Yeah, the whole text, if it's it should be there.
Some lovely percentile dice.
Oh, you're killing me, man! You're killing me. But it's true. But what they did was they had character development, and the character development had people going through different basic sections in their back history, like where they got part of their military training or something, and the characters would encounter each other at different parts during this in the sort of diagram of their backstory, and you got to say like how I met this person and how that interaction went. I feel like Dungeon World does the same thing, and it presupposes that you're a group to begin with, and it's up to you guys to explain it. And when you ask the characters, hey, this bond that you guys have together says, I have seen in prophecy that this character will do this. Like, what does that mean to you? Or where did you meet when you heard this prophecy? And it means that the characters then, by the time you're done, like all the characters are going, yeah, this is how this happened, or I really hate you, or this didn't work well, or I don't really trust you. I mean, you're that, or like we have this rivalry going on where I'm the one who has to pay for dinner or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's those little details that the characters don't even think about whether they want to join the group. They think about how the group works to begin with, and presupposing that there's a functional organism or dysfunctional in some way. You end up with half the time they just walk into the adventure not even realizing that they've already done most of the work for the GM, and it makes for a very different experience.
You got me really wanting to play
players
that
as well. Yeah, I mean, I've had players that even though I've put them in positions where their characters are intended to hate each other, like in Wrath and Glory, I had like the adversaries narratively, but the two players work together to embrace that rivalry. Whereas you'd get some players who are like, I'm intentionally going to fuck you over because that's what my character would do. And it's like, you're saying that's what your character would do, but you're just being an arsehole.
I mean, you saw that.
online.
I mean, you saw it a lot in like the old vampire games from White Wolf, where if you read the material, everybody was supposed to be sociopathically dedicated to their own survival or advancement, typically both. And there was very little reason for people, other than just randomly falling in love or a shared enemy, there wasn't a lot of reason for people to develop strong long-term relationships. I mean, you're talking about predators who, and the motion was not supposed to happen over like the period of a couple of weeks or months. Like you were supposed to advance through long-term plotting and a personal advancement over the period of decades or centuries. I always found that juxtaposition not to work very well because the characters were always disruptive, always would move for immediate change. either by a byproduct of their choices or through direct decapitation of the person at the top.
That's the way it's supposed to be.
I mean,
his fucking head off.
I mean, and if you had to ask, like, after a while, like, so this antediluvian over here, or this character, you know, this third generation or whatever Ventru who's in charge, or La Sombra or whatever clan that they're part of, like, how did they get to this position, and why is it so static if a bunch of neonates who are like 8th or 9th generation can just walk in and run the place? Like, I as a GM have to figure out why someone else who's more capable than them hasn't already done this. And it can't be like I this is one of like my tropes as a GM that I've tried to work through. It's one of the reasons I don't like running Supernatural in modern settings, because there's that one guy, and if it's not me, it's going to be another player who will say, well, in reality, all I have to do is buy this from the hardware store and I can affect this result. And they're like, well, your character doesn't know. And I'm like, well, I can do it here. I'll put it through Google. Look. I'm like, son of a bitch, he's right. You can figure out how to lockpick on Google.
Google ruins everything.
I mean, it's the internet is fantastic, but it's like, so the anarchist cookbook is out there. There's stuff like the poor man's James Bond. Like, you can, if you want to in your personal life develop as a non-adventurer, you can develop a lot of skills, basic chemistry work that you can do in your kitchen. I mean, there's stuff out there for you to deal with most problems. Like, alchemical silver is not that difficult to get hold of. Like,
I think then you'd have to scale the problem, right? You'd have to make a bigger problem. If everyone has access to this base knowledge, then you need to make it more complex, maybe.
No, I think that's right. But I mean, my larger point is that the supernatural isn't so interesting when technology can be a basic person with interest in technology, or a supernatural with interest in technology can use. What is it? Someone said in one of the games I was playing, they were like, well, they ran into I can't remember why, but it was we were both players, and he ran into a scenario where he found a claymore mine, and the GM rightly pointed out that the character had no military background whatsoever. And he's like, yeah, but I've watched all these Vietnam movies, and they use claymores like this all the time. And that's like, and another player who was in person had actually been in the military. He's like, yeah, it's pretty much accurate. And I'm like, God damn it! I'm like, you as a GM, you either have to make an incredibly an untenable stand at that point, saying, well, practically speaking, your character doesn't, and the other one's like, and you're saying, like, as a role player, saying, well, really, I know, my player knows, my character figured this out, and I'm like, well, how do you argue against that? I mean, the obvious argument to me mechanically is, because you as a character figured that out in the modern day doesn't mean your player or your character under stress in this moment can put all these things together and make it work right. Just because you have the knowledge doesn't mean you have the practical experience.
Yeah, I had that the other week where I had a player they were getting a coach, and the drivers had a heavy night of drinking and fell asleep, and the horses just came to a standstill. So one of the players was like, well, I'll take the reins and I'll drive these horses. And I was like, okay, well, make this test and you're going to have this penalty. And someone was like, well, why does he have a penalty? And I was like, well, have you ever driven a coach before? And he's like, no. And I was like, well, there you go. Right? I mean, what else could I say?
No. The answer is no. You can't do it.
I give him that little bit of hope by just you can roll dice.
And then you crush it.
Jim gives them hope. I just straight up say no, because I say no.
Yeah, and it's go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, there's this whole thing with tabletop role-playing games where, like Richard's played in my games, I played in his, and I feel that both of us are pretty supportive dungeon masters or game masters. And there's this whole narrative nowadays of, oh, never say no to your players. And so, but sometimes you have to, because the world that you're creating or the situation just requires you to say, "Hey, look, no, you can't do that."
Yeah.
Well, I mean, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
All right. I was going to say that I feel like a lot of that is that our society nowadays tells people it doesn't like telling people no. And we try to push that into games. And what that leads to, without the obvious social commentary that goes along with that, is that as a GM, you get players who don't. And I used to be one of these people. I'm like, I consider failure failing. Like failure as a character is failing in me as a player. And I no longer feel that way because people have shown me the error of my ways. But it leads, if you can embrace failure or limitations as a player or character, you'll find that I think it leads to better stories. It means that other characters are useful. It means that you have to interact with NPCs and the narrative to accomplish goals. One of the games that we played was it's called My Life with Master, and it's not a role-playing game in the campaign sense. It's a storytelling game that you play over 1 or 2 sessions where you're all minions of this one, like Frankenstein or some creature. And by the way, this is a very dark, it's not a nice game. You're not good people in this, generally speaking. And you determine whether or not in the game, like one person runs it as a GM and the other players are all trying to you're all trying to accomplish some goal. Either you're becoming more monstrous or you're becoming more humane. And you will roll whether or not you succeed at the beginning of the session of the scene. And then the GM will tell you if you fail, what's actually going to happen. And then you have to play out your own failure. And in the beginning, I found this very, very difficult to manage mentally because I had the objective is to win. And I was like, but I want to do this. And like, now you're telling me I can't do this. Like, not that my character wasn't capable of it, but you're telling me the story doesn't work this way. I'm not allowed to pursue the option which I find to be most optimal. And being placed in that position, like, it's literally storytelling. You're like, well, you lead to weird scenarios in which I think one time the rest of us were our master told us to build a new, better body from people with better body parts. And my wife at one point was figuring out how to get this guy to drink the food or drink the tea or something that would put him unconscious so we could harvest his brain for the piece. And it was a very disturbing moment. It wasn't one of those, because one, my character did not want to do it. I personally didn't want to do it. And the other 2 players were like, yeah, let's do the evil thing. And it was one of those break moments where I was like, sometimes you just have to embrace the fact that GM says no. And it can lead to great storytelling if you embrace it. Now, I guess if the GM says no all the time, and it's just like the GM telling you how the story is going to play out, that's not fun. But players and characters, I mean, the whole reason we have different classes in D&D is because they're things that you can't do or things you don't know about.
Yeah, there's a big difference between telling people narrative outcome and taking narrative control over their character, which I never do unless I explicitly say to someone, look, to tell out this next part, is it okay if I take liberty with your character for just a moment? There'll be no negative outcome. But if there's a negative outcome or some kind of narrative decision, it should be up to the player. And I get what you're saying, like saying no all the time to the point where you're railroading them and then just getting them to do what you want. That's not fun.
It's not.
Yeah, but I mean, you guys, you kill people all the time, right? Or at least occasionally. Like,
not all the time.
Not all the time? That sounds like a defensive. That sounded very defensive.
It's all their fault. Not me.
It's not personal, right?
Some of the time it is personal. But no, I mean, I see what y'all are saying. I try not to railroad them, and I think I do a fairly good job of not. But I mean, there's just sometimes that, you can't do something. Like, oh, I'm going to jump off this mountain and fly. No, you can't. You're going to fall. and stupid stuff like that. Because I mean, I've had some players that, oh, I want to do this. No, you can't. Yeah, and they'll get upset. So, well, you're not doing the game right. No, I'm following the rules right here. It says I am the dungeon master, and
It's called fucking gravity.
Yeah, and
This
my
isn't the rules. This is
decision
physics.
final. Exactly. It says my decision is final. So no. I mean that's just how it goes sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to distinguish, like, when a character is being railroaded. It depends on the setting, and like I've talked about pulp games before, where the whole thing is like you literally sometimes tell a player, like, here's how you're going to fail in this scenario, and we're going to narrate how you succeed out based on your previous failure in the next scene. That's different than me telling you that there's a chance of you driving the carriage, letting you roll when I already know damn well you're not going to be able to do it. That's not fair. That's not fair to the player. It's better for me just to say no. And like I don't know. To me, there's like there's a social contract between the characters and the GM, and it runs something like, I have to play by the rules most of the time, so that when I choose to break the rules for narrative or other purposes, they believe that it's for a good reason, or that the mechanics in some way justify it. And like sometimes I'll just make a mistake in rules. It happens. Every GM does it. And
you need to edit that part out. We don't need
that. Well, I mean, a lot of times I won't. Someone will say, like, realistically, that's not how magic works. Like the character will sit down and say, I don't understand why this happened. I cast detect magic, and this is happening, but I should be able to detect magic in this case. In a lot of cases, my reaction as a GM is then, that's true. You should ask why that's the case. And it leads to me having to change the story, but it means that often, like, I think my wife's favorite example was in one of the Exalted games that she played. She rolled this ridiculous perception check. And the GM was like, why are you rolling for perception check? I'm like, well, I'm looking, like, maybe there's a hidden ship behind our ship. And the GM's response was, yeah, you know what? There is. And that was how the game moved on. So yes and no, I guess, are fluid concepts, but I just don't like it when GMs give people hope of something, like as if they're rolling, given the opportunity to roll, as if the outcome could be positive, like they could wave their arms fast enough to fly. Yeah, but you're not going to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if there was zero chance of that guy driving the coach, I would have said to him, look, you don't know how to do that. You're just going to be flapping around the reins and hoping something happens. But, if there is a chance that it can happen, then yeah, by all means, roll. And again, some people like rolling dice. That's a big part as well. Some people just want to make skill checks all the time. And to go back to what you were saying before about the narrative part of D&D and the modifiers as well, which we were talking about from Pathfinder earlier, I really wish the proficiency linked to that knowledge that you were talking about with the claim or mine, where this proficiency has a narrative outcome more so than a modifier and is in some way integral to running the game. It seems like that would fit better with the structure of D&D 5e rather than just a flat out +2, +3,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, well, that's why the modifier increases as you go in level, and there are things you are proficient in, things you aren't.
But that's what I mean,
but you can still roll for it, right? And I think that's part of the problem, is that when you look at these scenarios, is there's nothing that says, like, I guess the example I would give is rock gnomes are supposed to be very familiar with, like, magical devices and stuff in history of all these things. But you just assume that the entire race has a +2 or +4 modifier on, because like all of them are just inbuilt geniuses when it comes to magical history. And like that's not. I don't like that as a player. Like, I understand mechanically, it's something I'll buy into as a player. Like, there are some edges of the mechanics that you just have to accept, but it kind of cheapens the other person who has to pay a skill slot for proficiency in Arcana, right?
The thing is, though, as well, that, like, I'm talking about the proficiency modifier not fully fitting with the idea of D&D 5e, the same as this whole species or race modifier that's thrown in of +2, +1. in the grand scheme of things, a +1 means fuck all to your character. I really don't see the point there. I'd much rather have a lineage type thing, but more narrative input to your character, as you say. So you're not trying to necessarily min-max numbers. You're looking at the character itself.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I'd be interested. I mean, there are two areas I found that like role playing games have not live or die on, but they're the things that break suspension of belief for me the fastest, and it's social mechanics and it's knowledge mechanics.
Yeah,
and it's not because either of those are particularly unusual to gaming. It's because the social mechanics. If I get to the point where I can just throw dice at a problem and make someone do something, it feels a lot like psychic manipulation or just like brainwashing, And I'm not saying this as a person who's like who wants to do those things, but I'm saying as a GM, it's very difficult to feel like I have narrative control or whether my NPCs are going to act normally if someone can just roll 8 dice, get enough successes, and say like, "Yeah, I will sell you my house for a penny." I think
you have to separate what they're saying though, because if you just take what a player says, sometimes like we had a bard in our D&D campaign who Richard knows, and
the worst.
He would just say this ridiculous shit and then roll a persuasion check, and in the end I'd just say to him, "Hey man, look, what's your intention here? What are you trying to get out of this situation? Okay, well, let's roll for that, and then here's what happens, and then even if you say something ridiculous, we'll honor what you've achieved." Yeah,
and I don't. It's up like, and there's some games where that's totally appropriate, where that's just that's part of the system, and you buy into it by virtue of playing the game in the first place. But I mean, and there are others where the other one that, like I said, that always blows me away is knowledge. I'm like, so I have a rank 5 knowledge skill. I'm going to roll my dice, and it turns out that I don't know this. And there's the other guy who's like, well, I'm also going to roll a die, and I just happen to roll the exceptional success. Like, but you're an idiot. I'm a professional who's trained in this. Or like every person who's ever lived has a chance of figuring out what this random mystery was that no one's found for thousands of years, and you just happen to identify it in this case. Like it's, I think that's basically the other side of the coin that you're talking about is why are we rolling dice in this case? Why does one person who has no experience in this get a chance? And in a lot of cases, I'll just tell players, look, you can't roll for this. It's not really in your background. But
yeah,
in some systems, like anybody can roll for anything.
Yeah, like D&D 5e is definitely that way. And I much prefer some kind of a tag system for knowledge where you share tags or have them under your knowledge. And so therefore you have some innate knowledge and then you can roll on top of that, as you're saying. But yeah, it's kind of silly in D&D 5e as well. Feeling unique, the skills do nothing for that at this point unless you're very proficient in it. It really is just a case of everyone can do everything to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's the balance between like, what's the difference between Arcana and history at some point? Like
history is such a fucking.
I mean, yeah, but you know what I mean. That's my point. Is that history, religion, and Arcana are just subdivided. So in practice, they are very different, or in principle, they're very different skills. But in practice, I can, as a player, I can make a very strong argument, Your Honor, in favor of me using any of these. Like that piece of magic was actually part of my religion's backstory. It's part of my entire faith space system. You know, it's happened in this God story before.
Shit.
Then there goes the neighborhood.
Yep. That's why my characters die all the time. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. You know,
I think, D&D 5e is at a turning point where it's trying to embrace the narrative aspect of the modern approach that they've sort of tailored, but it can't really leave behind the modifiers. But at a certain point, which one is it going to embrace further? You know, it's kind of difficult to determine what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I do like how what they've done in terms of scaling combat into a set of modifiers that makes sense is, as a person who's watched like mages forever, not having a modifier on there, like either their spells are automatically effective or they have to roll a touch attack with their like pitiful non-combat modified bodies. It is nice to see that the proficiency system they've really elegantly addressed a lot of what I'd call like the failings of your system of prior systems, where it was either complete success or certain classes could just succeed at anything, as provided they had the right spell, or there was no chance that they could do anything in certain arenas.
Well,
but I see what you're saying.
Still, still
I always
amazing.
hit with magic missile. I'm like, oh, that's a good reason to take magic missile, isn't it?
That's why I keep magic missile. Every time.
Absolutely, man.
I'm surprised it's not a cantrip.
I think
Yeah,
it needs to be.
But then you could use it as many times as you want, and you can. Yeah, I guess technically you could buff it up. Yeah, that's a good point.
It's scalable. But
I mean, you can let it be like maybe 1d4 plus 1 damage every time. You know, just one missile. But yeah,
Well,
hell, I'd take it.
Cast at third level, like whatever. I don't know. I like what they've done in that regard. But I see your point too in terms of where it's trying to, like, there's never going to be that perfect system. But
No.
I think it's done a great job of trying to become a nuanced version of its older iterations. I mean, for me, 4th edition, when I looked at the base rule set and talked to friends who'd played it, I'm like, that sounds like a great game. I don't know if I want to pretend to be playing a role-playing game while I'm doing it. And it sounds like more battle map work, which is the opposite of what I wanted as a player and a GM. It sounds like they balanced it out to where they found a midpoint that works for a lot of people. But there is going to be, I guess, that like pain point where how complicated or how difficult do you want to make this, or how many rules do you want to simplify down to make this work?
Yeah, D&D 5e is definitely like the best current system for epic fantasy, but at the same time, we've discussed before, like Richard and I said, it feels like it's being pulled in so many directions at the moment, and it just, yeah, I really don't know what's going to happen to it now. Where I don't think it'll be the same game in a year's time. I think it'll be quite different. I think they're going to move to 5.5 or 6 edition sooner rather than later, with the way things are going.
What kind of things are you talking about in terms of changing it? I mean, I've just walked into it basically over this past couple of days. Like, is it significantly different than it used to be, or what kind of forces are pushing on it?
I just feel that it's changed drastically in terms of taking out a lot of the modifiers and stuff, which I like, and I really like the advantage system. But in terms of changing it, they seem like they're going to more of a lineage type approach, like Pathfinder. But at the same time, they're leaving behind the traditional thing of ability score modifiers, which were kind of, you know, the base of what you know of D&D. And at that point, if you're going towards that lineage idea, and what they're saying is you only inherit, for example, dark vision for a drow, something like that. You get stuff that's innate to their genetics, but anything else culturally, like languages, is something you get from their, say, background, which makes a lot of sense. But then by doing away with those modifiers, that sort of takes away a base system of D&D, and I feel like they're trying to push towards that narrative way, but then they're still, at the same time, they're handing us these lineages with modifiers, and it's like, well, which do you want? I really don't know.
That's not in the current play on D&D Beyond. At least it's not in the player's handbook. Is this something like a revised version they're publishing?
I believe it's in Arcana.
Yeah, so they said that going forward, they're going to do away with modifiers. It's just going to be something you pick. So you pick a +2 and a +1 in something, and then you're going to now do it this way in the future. So Unearthed Arcana is basically content they push out to play test, and then later they bring it into the game.
Interesting. That's that's very, very like what I've seen in what people have done with Dungeon World, where you in the version, the base version, which is what all these things are derived from, a lot of the sub games, you can get up to like a +3, I think it is, with an 18, and then like the 16 and 17 is +2, etc. And a lot of games have said, we don't want to do 1 to 18 based attributes anymore. We're just going to say you have a +2 and one, like distribute the modifiers. Don't worry about the attribute number itself. And it does simplify it down, but I agree, it takes a certain like nostalgic feel away from players like me who grew up with roll 3d6 and hope you get more than one that's 3 6s, and hopefully none of them are 3 1s.
Well, yeah, as we say, like, some people just love rolling dice, and don't get me wrong, like it makes sense to me, this change in the character attribute modifiers, because, for example, people are making the argument, well, technically something like an ogre is going to have a higher strength value than a halfling, which of course they would. But I mean, a +2, how does an ogre only have 2 more strength than a halfling? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I'd like it if they had something in there that was specific to their size. Narratively, he's small and he's large, so here's the difference in how stuff's going to play out between them, rather than here's a number. That makes perfect sense to me. But again, some people just love rolling dice.
Yeah, I mean, they have that now in the rules, at least for the ones I've saw. One of the elements is if someone is 2 sizes bigger than you can move through their square as a hostile square. I think you still probably provoke a potential attack on you, but you can actually move through their square as opposed to around it.
Yeah, but what I'd like to see is, like, if you're a size larger, you automatically get advantage or some kind of other benefit as well as others, and then here's the negatives to being larger. You can't use this, you can't do that, or you can do this and you can do that. I'd like it to be, fleshed out more, and then it feels like I'm really this character. They're pushing this narrative, but I don't feel like they're very different, the species.
That makes sense. I mean, that also makes you question, like, what's the difference between a 20-foot tall humanoid and a 2-foot tall humanoid? Like, what's the mechanical difference? Like, obviously, physically interacting with the world is going to be different, but and that's the whole point of putting numbers on things, is you're quantifying it. If you're not going to quantify it, then what's the point?
Yeah, well, that's from the dice rolling perspective, but then from this narrative approach that they've given you, you can just put that thing of the tags rather than modifiers, which seems to be what they're doing, where you're large, so therefore you can't use light armor or something like that, rather than just adding numbers to it.
Yeah, that's I don't know. I as you probably already gleaned, like, I'm all for simplifying systems down to a point, but you can bring it down to the point where you're actually detracting from the core brand that you're selling with your product.
Yeah, they should have a D&D classic where it does keep those attributes. I'd really like to see different versions. I was saying to Richard, you could technically have a core rule book and then a supplement for the way in which people want to play. It seems like some people want that, but again, it's easier to have rounded things, so then any adventure supplements aren't all fucked up from different rule systems and so on and so forth. But again, if D&D are doing away with character attributes, then what's to stop them from pulling away in other ways? Because I mean, at some point the modifiers won't mean anything if you keep pulling them out of everything.
Yeah, I know it. I know that, like, how Dungeon World deals with that is you don't actually have random damage per weapon. Each class has a damage die, and for example, like a paladin or a fighter, it's like usually a D10. For a rogue, it's like a D8. I'm oversimplifying to some degree, but like the weapon you pick determines like whether it has reach or not, whether the range it can do. Some of them are forceful, where if you hit with it, it knocks people over or sends them flying. Some of them are messy because they make a mess when they hit something, like that kind of thing. I can't think, but like maybe you could do that with a race too, like big or messy, or has certain characteristics associated with it. But I mean, it does. I've got Dungeon World for that. Like, I don't need the whole point of Dungeon World is that it's slimmed down. You drive like an arrow right at the story, and you don't sweat the small things. I don't know if D&D would benefit from that, from my perspective. Like, one of the reasons I like it is because you have to worry about numbers to some degree.
Yeah, it's like a simplified version of a number-heavy game, but it seems like they're pulling out. It's quite confusing. They're saying one thing on one hand with these narrative decisions, and on the other, they're trying to implement lineages which will create other modifiers. I don't think anyone knows what they're doing. I think they made a rash decision to say, moving forward, this is what we're going to do. And everyone was like, okay, that's fine if you want to do away with those character attributes, but you have to have something just as impactful for my character creation. And you haven't provided an alternative yet.
Yeah, I'm certainly open to the argument that numbers for races just causes people to arrange their preset attributes in areas that will let them maximize it.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's fair. But I mean, then you can also make the argument that in doing so, I'm also determining the kind of orc or elf or gnome or human that I'm going to play. Like, if I want those attributes, I'm playing the best version of this particular race for this class based on my concept. I don't think it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive.
Well, you do that for the class anyway, right? To pick the class, and then you're doing it with the race. But then the problem is with the race is that they're pigeonholing you into a trope. I get that, like, an orc is strong, so therefore he's a fighter, a barbarian, blah blah blah. I do understand that they want to say, well, why can't an orc be a good bard? That makes sense to me. As I'm saying, I don't have an issue with that either. But I think what you're saying is that your brand is to have those attributes, and then I agree with that. And my issue is that if they're going to take those away, they need a strong replacement, and they haven't even hinted at what they're going to do.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think that's part of it. Is like part of what draws that's been kind of D&D's hallmark is a little bit of the crunch, a little bit of the numbers. It's where a lot of us learn to role play. Or not role play, but just interact with mechanical systems. I mean, it's I can still remember, like in college, a friend of mine who had taken advanced statistics, and one guy was doing like calculus, and the three of us were sitting there like, yeah, I'm sure. Like, all right, so I rolled this, and it's a 3 plus 7 plus 6 is obviously 12. And I'm like, hold on, go back. It's 16. And they're like, really? I'm like, yeah. We're arguing about basic addition and subtraction and multiplication. It's kind of part of the system. It's part of its historical draw for me. I don't know how it's the choices. It's like all the small choices and numerical, being able to play that off the math. Worrying about which spell I'm picking as a warlock and whether it scales up at higher levels, because all my spells are going to be cast at higher levels as I level up. So picking a first level spell, that doesn't advance with me isn't as useful to me as a warlock. It's like those small numerical quality of life choices so that I can build the character that I want that make D&D interesting to me and make it different than, say, Dungeon World or Rifts or more complicated systems.
Yeah, D&D 5e is definitely not balanced in terms of what you pick for your character. I mean, it's not broad enough that you can make a major mistake and completely fuck up your character, but also a lot of the spells are not balanced correctly. There's a lot of playtest issues with D&D 5e, but one of the things that I've encountered, because I run a bunch of workshops for new players, like probably around 20 at this point, for new players from different walks of life, and I found that I don't want to be derogatory about the television show. I don't think it's a television show, Critical Role. I've listened to a few podcasts of it, and they're, if you're not familiar with it, they're voice actors that play Dungeons and Dragons. And I, without being rude to anyone, I can tell the people that have watched that show and are coming into the game because they don't care about the crunch, and they're into doing silly voices and the narrative part, which I love. But as soon as I start mentioning die rolls, they just switch off. And so I think that's influencing the game as well to an extent. I know a lot of people refer to it as the Mercer effect, the Dungeon Master Matt Mercer, which isn't really fair because he's not done it intentionally. But yeah, I feel that's to some extent impacting the game for sure.
And I guess part of it is, so I've mentioned a whole slew of games during this recording. Like, there are lots of games out there. If you want to tell, I'm not saying that D&D shouldn't try to be able to tell better stories, but there are games that do the narrative style of play better than D&D. And if I go back to what I said before, like, I think it's very hard to find a game that'll do all things for all people. And if you try and be that game, you're probably going to tear yourself apart, because D&D at its baseline, I ran another Gen Con story. Like, when a couple of years after like our first game, I went at this thing called NASCRAG at Gen Con, and you're competing against other groups. Everyone gets the same basic set of modules. And it's totally silly. It's things like, I think in one of ours, it's totally satiring D&D. They have some basic D&D mechanics. So at the time, like 3 and 3.5, it helped to have some experience, but there wasn't a giant battle map. Like, a lot of it was certain story results were going to happen, and you as a group had to get up and do a line dance. Or I think at one point we had to make a wedding dress out of several rolls of toilet paper and pack of paper plates. Like, it was not I say this so that people understand that the point of it obviously was that the rules were only barely tangential to the experience the players were doing. And you were rated as groups based on the amazing shit you did and how well, when you were given an archetype for a character, like how well you played that character. My wife's character was a goblin cleric, and the big boss guy had been wounded a lot. And part of her backstory was that she had to heal people she couldn't see suffering, essentially. And she healed him as soon as he landed in front of her, and she got points for that and moved on. But cool. It was also, it was a narrative thing where you had to, like, at the end of the game, you had to write down what your wish was, and they ranked your characters based on how appropriate the wish was to, the backstory and stuff. And if you want that kind of game, that's fucking great. I love working with those kinds of players who either want something silly or want a deep. I mean, I mentioned it when I was talking about Hellas, where I want people to want to play serious games, and I just don't. Like, people say they want it, but like, for me, for serious, it's you never break character. You're 100% into the love of the setting. You want to delve into the great darkness or the great light. You're willing to stand at the gates of Thermopylae and be part of that 300, knowing that it's better to die in the shade of the arrows falling down and bound you than it is to live knowing you've betrayed your oath and your kinsmen are behind you. And whether the Athenians come now, that is a story for a later date. I will die a Spartan. Like, that's a great story. It's a good role play, but it's a different role play than Rick and Morty. You know what I'm saying? Like, there are different narrative experiences out there, and there are also different kinds of combat systems. If you just want to play miniatures and do it with a role play story behind it, there are games for that too. I just haven't found a system that does all of them well. I've just found the Dungeon World lets me tell the stories that I want to tell, and lets all of us get together and play games, and we can do it seriously or not seriously, and everybody seems to enjoy it. And if D&D wants to do that with 5th edition, I think they've got a good product from what I've seen so far. I'm not sure what I'd feel if they took some of the numbers out.
Yeah, I think the problem Richard and I have discussed before is that a lot of people see D&D as the first and only role-playing game available, and then because the community around it is a community that they enjoy, they want to be a part of it, and so they'd rather change the game than change the community that they're within, and so therefore they're asking for these changes. And don't get me wrong, a big part of D&D 5 Brew, you can change everything to how you want to play it and around that. And from what you're saying and from what I've read of Dungeon World, it seems like that would actually fit what they want to do for the game. It's about everything around it, the critical role, the community, and everything it represents to them, rather than having fun. You know what I
there's
mean?
external
Not that they don't
pressures
wanna
on
have fun,
people,
but
and they want to. They want to cater to the audience that they're certainly. My answer is yeah, sure, why not? You know, and I guess I've spent a lot of, I think I said before, like I've probably spent more time playing miniature ones game, and like there's so many other games out there. Like I play historical games at 15 millimeters for World War II that have zero familiarity to someone who's played 40K. There's Inquisitor, which I know is another Games Workshop product, but like it's huge miniatures, and like it's basically a role-playing game with tactical elements. There's so much stuff you can do with three-dimensional play. I play something now called Frostgrave and Rangers of Shadowdeep.
Oh yeah, I know that one.
Yeah, and their Rangers of Shadowdeep in particular is like, it's not there is no game master. You're not, you and your other player, you're involved in a narrative story that you're playing as as miniatures, but also as characters and with warbands, and you're working together to solve problems. And the AI basically runs it for you. So it's not saying that 40K isn't a miniature game. It obviously is, and it sells a lot of models, and it's a big part of the industry. But it's not the only place you can enter the environment.
40K is D&D 5e for miniatures, in the sense that it's
100%.
extremely broad, but it's not very deep.
Yes. Well, and it's changing. Like even 40K of now is different than when I joined back in my day. I played third edition.
I started with
That's right.
mate.
That's right. We used the hover tank deodorant shots. You know, we put the deodorant at the skin. You guys and your sprays. We only had sticks, and we've turned the darn, and the little twist at the bottom was the jet engine. And that was how we made our hover tanks, and we liked it. God damn it! And the Emperor purged, and that was good enough for us.
On that note, Richard's just texted me saying he's got to go soon. Would you come back on the podcast sometime, Matthew?
Love to.
That was awesome, man. I feel like we could talk for hours.
Straight up, no. No, it's been a lot of fun. I just had something I got to do at like 12:30, so I got to get out of here. But y'all are welcome to stay and talk.
We'll wrap up there, man, and we'll have Matthew back on whenever he has time. Thanks for joining us, Matthew.
Thanks for having me. Anytime you guys want me, let me know.
That was awesome, man. Want to learn about more RPGs?
Me too.
Definitely gonna have to look up some of those, and I'd love
Actually,
to get
I've
campaign.
I've downloaded 2 of them.
You're such a nerd.
I know.
But I do appreciate it, and I hate to cut it short, but I'll have to talk with y'all later, and for everybody else, we'll hear you next week then.
Richard, Jim, thanks for having me.